Tab 1 early on the morning of January 12, 1765, a 12-year-old boy named Jacques Pou sat up suddenly in his bed, breathing hard and fast. The small bedroom he was in was pitch black. He could not see his own hand in front of his face, but he could feel that he was sweating and his heart was racing. He tried to shake his head back and forth to try to wipe the terrible nightmare he had just had from his mind, but he just could not do it. All he could think about was how in this nightmare something had been chasing him. He had been running for his life through the dark trees trying to get away, but whatever this thing was, this horrible beast that was following him, it just kept getting closer and closer and closer until it finally reached out and got him. And that is what woke him up. Jacques reached up and touched his face in the dark, and he realized he was crying. He quickly wiped the tears away because he did not want any of his brothers or sisters to see that he was crying. Jacques was the oldest of 8 kids in his family, and all of them slept in the same small room on straw-filled mattresses inside of their family little stone cottage in the southern French province of Gabon. And so Jacques is looking around the dark bedroom to make sure none of his siblings had woken up and seen him in this state, and he was relieved to see that they were all still fast asleep, breathing softly. Everybody in the village made fun of Jacques for being a scaredy cat, for being a coward, and to Jacques this really hurt his feelings because on some level he knew it was kind of true. In fact, just a couple of months earlier, he had lost in a physical fight with a much younger boy. Afterward, Jacques had cried, and the whole town had seen this happen. And so, afterward, all the kids began calling Jacques the wet chicken, and even Jacques' brothers and sisters began joining in and calling him the wet chicken, really making him feel totally ashamed. It was not like the adults in this village were stepping up and protecting Jacques, because to them, Jacques was kind of like a liability. In this part of France, the winters were brutal. People died all the time in this village from the freezing weather, and then the summers brought all these outbreaks of disease which wiped out even more people in this village. And so, by and large, where Jacques lived, it was kind of like the survival of the fittest, and many kids did not live that long unless they were really hardy and tough like their parents who had managed to survive for that long. But Jacques was just not like that. He was very gentle and peaceful, yet somehow he had survived. Jacques was not trying to become this kind of macho guy. Instead, he really wanted to be a priest like his uncle, but his uncle lived far away, and so it was tough to see his uncle all that often to learn about how to become a priest. But anytime Jacques did get a chance to actually see his uncle, he would have a chance to read all these books and study alongside his uncle. And so, for a little while, it was like Jacques was transported away from the hardships of his village to the life that in many ways he wished he had, a quiet, peaceful, very studious life. But deep down, Jacques felt like there was no chance he would ever actually escape this little village where he effectively was an outcast. Even though the sun had not risen yet, Jacques just sat on his bed and could not fall asleep again after waking up from this nightmare. And so, just sitting there in the dark and the quiet, listening to the soft breathing of his family, Jacques began to think about what he had to do later that day when the sun did come up. And like usual, Jacques started to feel afraid of the tasks ahead. So, Jacques eventually just laid down with his eyes open, and he laid there until dawn when one of his younger brothers named Jean, who was 8 years old, rolled over and pushed him and said, "Hey, wet chicken, it is time to get up. It is our day with the sheep. Let us go." Jacques scowled at his younger brother and shoved him back, but not that hard, because Jacques never really shoved anybody that hard, no matter what they did to him. Then, both boys hopped out of their bed and stood on the cold wooden floor. They quickly wolfed down some simple bread and cheese for breakfast, and then they headed out the door into the freezing morning air. As soon as they were outside, Jacques noticed that the village was much quieter than it normally was at this hour, but then again, these days, villagers did not leave their homes unless they absolutely had to. It was like a ghost town. And so, Jacques and Jean made their way away from their cottage, walking down the icy dirt road to the pen where their family kept all of their sheep. The boys opened up the gate and then used their staffs to kind of corral the sheep out of the gate, back onto the road. As the sheep kind of bleated and bumped into each other, the boys worked hard to kind of organize them on the road. And then, once the sheep understood which direction they were going, towards the forest, a very familiar walk for the sheep, they kind of fell into line and just began walking very casually, like they knew exactly where to go. Once the sheep had fallen into this kind of routine rhythm, Jacques and Jean fell in behind them and just walked quietly after them. As the boys walked, they both constantly kept looking left and right, ahead of the sheep and behind them, constantly scanning the woods for danger because they knew something was out here. For months now, children all across this province in France, Gabon, had been going missing. They would go off into fields or pastures, like when they were moving their family livestock around, and the kids would just vanish. Then sometimes, if they were found again, they would be found totally mutilated, far from where they should have been. The attacks on these kids across Gabon had begun a year earlier, on June 30th, 1764. On that day, a 14-year-old girl, who actually was the older sister of one of Jacques' friends, had disappeared and then been found again later that day, partially eaten in a field near her home after she had not come home with the family cattle. Now, of course, this was very tragic, but to this point, there had not been any other attacks, so there was no pattern here. The assumption was she must have been attacked by a wolf, which did happen, and often to children because kids at this time in France were often in charge of tending to their family grazing animals the way Jacques and Jean were going out with their sheep. These kids were small, they could not really defend themselves, and if a wolf set onto them, there was very little they could do. But 5 weeks after this 14-year-old girl was found dead and mutilated in the field, 2 more teenagers were also found mutilated and dead in a field, and really, this was only the beginning. As summer turned to fall that year, more and more kids went missing and then turned up dead in fields, partially mutilated. The more these attacks happened across southern France, the more people thought to themselves, this cannot be a wolf. Number 1, wolves do not go on extended human killing sprees. That is just not a thing. And number 2, if it was a wolf, they would be eating more of their victims. They would not just rip their body to shreds and then leave them, they would eat the meat. And so, by this early January day in 1765, as Jacques and Jean were setting out for the day with their family sheep, the death toll from whatever was killing these kids was now well into the dozens. People in France had begun calling whatever was killing these children the Beast of Gibon, and stories about this creature began popping up in newspapers all over France. People all across southern France began forming these huge hunting parties to go out into the forests and the wilds of Gibon to find this creature and kill it, but they would always come back empty-handed. Every now and again, a hunter would be out and they would see a huge wolf, and they would kill it and declare that they had found and killed the Beast of Gibon. But the attacks on these kids all across this province just continued, so obviously that wolf was not it. As these attacks continued, all the fairs and festivals that normally would pop up all year long all across southern France, those all stopped because people were afraid to go out in fear of this creature. And then, of course, in villages like Jacques Village, people really just stopped going out unless they had to, again because of the Beast of Gibon. But Jacques and Jean family relied on their livestock and they needed their sheep to go out and graze. So, on this day in January, Jacques and Jean had to go out because their sheep had to graze, as their family relied on the sheep. Livestock was their livelihood, and so this was a mandatory thing. As Jacques and Jean continued walking behind their herd of sheep down this dirt road towards the forest, the 2 boys eventually came to a stop and just turned around and looked back at their village. They saw walking on the road towards them were 5 more kids, along with 2 additional herds of sheep that these 5 kids were in charge of. Ever since the Beast of Gibon had become a thing, Jacques and Jean had begun tending their sheep along with these 5 kids and their sheep. They figured the bigger their group was, the safer they were from this creature. As the 5 kids got closer to Jacques and Jean, Jacques realized that one of the kids that was with them this day was a tall, thin redhead. It was the same younger boy who had recently beaten Jacques up in front of the village, and he had cried and everyone had made fun of him. So, Jacques sees this kid coming, and immediately, he can feel his face burning with embarrassment. The boy sees Jacques and he immediately smirks and begins flapping his arms like chicken wings. But once these 5 kids and their sheep joined Jacques and Jean and their sheep, they all kind of just went quiet because none of them wanted to be out there. They were all scared of the Beast of Gibon, and the only reason they were together was to be safe from this creature that was killing kids left and right. In relative silence, all of the kids and their sheep just slowly walked together down this dirt path, and eventually they made it into the big forest where, just beyond the forest, was the pasture where the sheep would graze. As the group actually entered into the trees and it became dark and more quiet and kind of eerie, Jean actually tugged on Jacques' shoulder and said, "Will you please tell a story?" Jean was scared too, all the kids were scared, and they figured that if Jacques just told a story, it would take their mind off of how tense this moment was. When Jacques heard this request, he actually smiled because this was something he loved to do. He was a great storyteller, and it was like his one strength. When Jean had asked for the story, the kids and the sheep had actually made it to really the end of the forest path, and so by the time Jacques was about to start a story, all the sheep had made their way out of the forest onto this big open pasture right in the middle of the forest. As the sheep just kind of filtered out into this open area, Jacques stopped, and all the kids kind of came up right behind him. Jacques started his story by pointing across the pasture to this bog that was right at the base of this hill, and he said, "Do you see those big rocks in that bog over there? Well, do you see the biggest rock? Well, that is not really a rock. It is actually a doorway, and if you move the rock, underneath it there is a portal to another world." And so, as Jacques began telling this very creative story about this kingdom that existed underneath the bog, he sat down against a rock kind of facing out towards the sheep, and all the other kids kind of filed in around him, taking seats with Jean, his brother, sitting right behind him to his right. Jacques was really into the story, to the point where he kind of forgot about what was happening with the sheep, and he was not scanning around for danger. Neither were any of the kids, including the redhead who had beaten Jacques up. He wanted to act like he was not into his story, but in reality he totally was, and he was just as interested in what was going on with the magical kingdom below this rock. Finally, when Jacques got to the end of his story, where this evil giant that had been tormenting the kingdom under the bog had been tricked by an orphan to try to go through this magical portal into their world, and the giant had gotten stuck in the doorway because he was so big, and he never tormented the kingdom again, and they lived happily ever after. When Jacques got to that point in the story, and all the kids are totally locked in and not paying attention to anything else, two things happened in rapid succession. The first was, even though Jacques is telling the story and focusing on that, in the back of his mind he registers hearing the sound of twigs breaking somewhere right behind him, almost like the sound of someone or something moving along the forest floor. And the second thing that happened was the red-headed kid who had beaten up Jacques, without saying a word, just stood up and began sprinting towards the pasture. For a moment, Jacques thought this kid, who was kind of like a bully, was doing this on purpose to be rude to Jacques, to kind of run away at the climax of the story like he did not care about it. But then, Jacques realized that he smelled something terrible behind him. When Jacques turned around to see what was making the smell, he saw that his brother Jean, who had been sitting right behind him to his right, was now gone. Where he had been sitting was just his staff laying on the ground. For a second, Jacques just could not process what his eyes were seeing. He did not understand how his brother could have gotten away from him without him noticing. But before Jacques could do anything, all the kids around him that were still there began screaming and pointing up towards this hill that was right behind them. And so Jacques turned around, and to his horror, he saw there was this huge 12-foot tall creature that was covered in fur. It looked like an oversized wolf, but it was standing on two legs, and its bones seemed like they were too big for its own skin, and it made it seem very angular and jagged. As it kind of loped grotesquely up the hillside, Jacques realized it was carrying in its front arm Jean, who was screaming and kicking but could not get away from this creature. Jacques understood that this was the beast of Jabon, and it was going to go kill his brother. Immediately, Jacques is thinking, you gotta run away, get to safety, get out of here, and all the kids around him, that is what they did. They took off running towards the pasture. They did not care about Jean, they only cared about themselves. And so, Jacques, he knows he needs to get away to save himself, but his legs just will not move. He is rooted to the spot because something inside of him told him he has to save his brother. It does not matter if everyone thinks he is a coward, that is his brother, he needs to do something. And so Jacques, he turns to the kids who were running away from him, and he screams at them to stop, come back. The kids were so surprised to hear this strong, authoritative voice coming out of the wet chicken that they did stop and turned around to see what he wanted. He said, "Get over here, I have a plan." The kids, with the exception of the redhead who had run off by himself, they came back to Jacques, and Jacques began telling them his plan to save Jean. The kids again were so taken with how Jacques was really owning this moment and being a leader that they all said, okay, let us do this. And so, after this very quick planning meeting, all the kids turned and began running up the hillside towards the beast of Jabon with Jacques in the front with a staff out. The kids gained on the beast really quickly, and the creature clearly noticed and kept turning around and kept looking at these kids getting closer and closer. But the beast did not seem interested in any of them, it just wanted Jean. In fact, it moved Jean from its arm up into its mouth, and then the creature began kind of using the trees to pull itself faster and faster away from the kids. But Jacques, he just kept going faster and faster and pushing himself to get closer and closer, and as he did, it motivated the other kids to follow along and push it and gain on this creature. Finally, they got close enough to this beast that Jacques yelled out to the kids, "Now!" and they all fanned out around it and began smashing this beast with their staffs they used to shepherd their livestock. Now, none of their blows to this creature were doing any real damage, and the creature did not really seem fazed that the kids were now attacking it, but they were kind of able with their strikes to this creature to direct it and get it to kind of turn in the direction that Jacques had told them to make the creature go. And so, the kids continued to beat and poke and corral this creature, and every time they would hit it, the beast would kind of flail out with one of its arms, but it never really did anything because, again, it is really focused obviously on taking Jean. But eventually, Jacques' plan worked. He had corralled the creature to the top of the hillside right over where that bog was, where those rocks in the middle were part of the story that Jacques had told about how there was this portal to another world. Once this creature was positioned where Jacques wanted it, he again yelled to the kids to do the next phase of their plan, and all the kids kind of fanned out to the top of the hill, and with their staffs, they beat and poked this creature down the hill into the bog. As they did this, Jacques kept looking to see if Jean was alive, because earlier, he had been screaming and kicking, but now there was blood all over his brother, and he was limp in the creature mouth, and he was not making any sound. But Jacques did not care, he wanted to get his brother back, dead or alive. And so, finally, Jacques stepped forward from the group and he wound up and he smashed the beast as hard as he could, hard enough that the beast actually kind of stumbled forward into the actual marshy bog. What Jacques knew about this bog and why he had come up with that particular story about there being a gateway to another world is, weeks earlier, he had actually accidentally stepped into this bog and saw it was really deep, and he had been lucky enough that he had grabbed a rock and kind of pulled himself out, because if he had not, the bog kind of functioned like quicksand. You could get stuck in the bog and never get out again. And this is what happened to the Beast of Jabon. It went feet first into the one spot of the bog that Jacques had all the kids corral it to. That was the deepest and most dangerous part. As soon as the beast stepped into it, it sunk down to its waist, and immediately the beast reached out with its huge muscular arms and tried to pull itself out of the bog, but it could not. It was stuck, and so in its panic, it let go of Jean from its mouth, and it actually turned around and it looked at Jacques and the other kids. When it did, Jacques almost lost his nerve because when he saw this thing face to face up close, he saw this was not a wolf face. This was almost like a human face. Its eyes were making distinct eye contact with Jacques, and it was furious. It was like the beast understood that Jacques had just trapped it. He had tricked the beast into walking into this bog, and it wanted to kill Jacques. For a moment, Jacques was totally entranced by this creature's eyes. It just struck him that this looks human, it looks intelligent. What is this thing? And while Jacques was kind of in this daze, the creature reached forward and slashed his stomach wide open. Jacques fell backwards on the ground, but luckily he was far enough away from the beast that he could not be pulled back in. In this kind of frantic moment, one of the other kids saw an opportunity and ran forward, grabbed Jean, who was laying on the surface of the bog, and he pulled him away from the beast. The beast whipped around and tried to grab Jean, but he could not, and so all of a sudden, all these kids were safely away from the Beast of Jabon, who was totally trapped. At this point, the other kids who were not hurt, they scooped up Jacques and they scooped up Jean, and they began running away from the bog across the pasture back towards the village, leaving the beast where it was. As they ran, they heard it bellowing out and roaring and trying to pull itself out, but it's still just remained in the bog. Finally, as they got back to that dirt path that led back to the village, they saw there was a group of armed villagers running towards them because it would turn out the redhead who had run off, he had told the village and they were coming out to help the kids. And so, as the armed villagers met with the kids, they told them where the beast was, stuck in that bog, and the villagers took off to go kill the beast. Then, the kids along with Jacques and Jean, they went into the village. They were put into a home and put on beds, by which point the village doctor had come over and began treating both of them. Jean was alive, but just barely. He had lost a lot of blood and the beast had grabbed onto his scalp and really crushed his skull, but he would ultimately survive. As for Jacques, it was a very painful wound that he had sustained on his stomach, but none of his internal organs had been damaged, and so he would also survive as well. As for the armed villagers, even though they very quickly got out to that bog where the beast was when they got there, the beast was gone. It had escaped. The Beast of Jabon would continue to kill people for another 2 years, until June 19, 1767, when a hunter happened to encounter it in the middle of a forest and he shot and killed it. By that point, over 100 people had been murdered by this creature. The hunter would drag the carcass of the beast back into his village and a doctor would perform an autopsy, but the doctor was unable to identify what kind of animal it was. It did kind of look like a wolf, a really huge wolf, but its body was just so misshapen and its bones were too big, and it clearly walked on 2 legs, not on all 4s. And so there was never any definitive information about what this even was and how this even happened. But when they opened up its stomach, they did find human body parts. Jacques was one of the only people to have ever survived an encounter with the Beast of Jabon, and so he was celebrated all across France. He quickly went from being the wet chicken to the little hero, and his story would reach as far away as Boston, Massachusetts. In fact, Jacques' story was so well publicized that it eventually reached King Louis XV, and he was so moved by it that he invited Jacques to come meet him. After meeting Jacques, he loved him and offered to pay for his entire education. And so, Jacques would get to finally leave this little village where he never quite fit in, and he would move to northern France and enroll in a prestigious school there, and he would spend his days reading and writing, just like he had always hoped. To this day, historians and scientists still debate what the Beast of Jabon actually was. Some people believe it was a regular pack of wolves, while others argue that it was an exotic animal like a hyena or a lion that had escaped from a private menagerie. There are even those who believe it was a hybrid bred specifically to kill humans. The truth is that we will probably never know for sure what kind of monster terrorized the French countryside during those dark years. But what we do know is that a young 12-year-old boy, who was once mocked by his entire community as a coward and called the wet chicken, managed to overcome his deepest fears when it mattered most. He did not run away when a literal monster came for his little brother. Instead, he stood his ground, organized his friends, and fought back with nothing but a wooden staff and a clever plan. In a time and place where only the strongest survived, Jacques proved that true strength does not come from winning physical fights or being tough. It comes from the love and loyalty you have for your family and the willingness to risk everything to protect them. Jacques and Jean would carry the physical and emotional scars of that day for the rest of their lives, but they would also carry the bond of two brothers who survived the unthinkable together. The story of the wet chicken who became a hero remains one of the most incredible tales of courage in French history, a reminder that even the most gentle souls can find extraordinary strength when they are pushed to the absolute edge. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Short in 1765, a French village was haunted by a monster no one could identify. Its latest victims were two young shepherd brothers, Jacques and Jean, sent into the forest with their sheep despite dozens of children already disappearing. Then came the strange detail. Jean vanished silently, leaving only his staff behind. Everyone blamed the beast of Jebun, a wolf-like creature said to walk on two legs. But the twist was shocking. Jacques, mocked as a coward, didn't run. He trapped the beast in a deadly bog and saved his brother. The monster escaped, killing for 2 more years, and its true identity remains unsolved. Watch the full story on the channel. Tab 1 on the afternoon of August 2nd, 1998, a 48-year-old man named Mike Turner stopped for a moment on the side of a steep mountain. Mike was an imposing figure, standing at an impressive 6 feet 6 inches tall. He was strong, broad-shouldered, and had spent most of his life loving the great outdoors. But out here in the wild, even a man of his size felt incredibly small. Mike took his water bottle out of his backpack, unscrewed the plastic cap, and took a long, slow sip. He was standing in a small cluster of green pine trees on the side of this mountain, about 11,000 feet up in the air. This was inside of an area in Wyoming called the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. Now, if you have never heard of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, it is easily one of the most visually striking and beautiful places in the entire world. It looks like all of the extremes of nature kind of collided together in this one place. On one hand, you have these massive, jagged, 13,000-foot tall, snow-covered mountain peaks. You have actual glaciers sitting up there in the cold air. But then, right below them, right at the base of these huge mountains, are all these lush green fields full of tall grass and bright wildflowers. There are animals running around, and little streams, and crystal-clear lakes. It is absolutely picturesque. In fact, some of the pictures of this area look fake because they are just so ridiculous. But the real reason the Fitzpatrick Wilderness was known as this unbelievably beautiful place was because it went completely untouched by people. And the reason it went untouched was because it was so incredibly hard to get to. Basically, the only people who ever set foot in this very surreal landscape were highly experienced outdoors people like Mike Turner. It took a lot of know-how just to get to this area, let alone survive out there, because this is a very, very rugged place. But Mike Turner was not content just going to the Fitzpatrick Wilderness and staying on the safe paths. He really wanted to experience the true, untouched nature of this area. And so, what he was doing while he was out there was hiking entirely off-trail. He was in this totally remote place, walking around in an area that was not even marked on a map. Now, to anybody who has not done any compass and map navigating out in the wild, this might seem totally reckless. And to a degree, it sort of is. But it is also something that some people just have an innate knack for. Some people have a special skill to understand where they are in relation to terrain features, and if you combine that with proper training and experience, these guys get really good at just being able to navigate with a map and compass. Mike was one of those people who was an excellent navigator. Walking off-trail like this in such a remote place was actually sort of routine for him. But Mike was not some full-time professional adventurer. This was just something he did that was a deep passion for him. His actual job was that he was a reverend at a Christian church in Idaho. He had been doing that for 10 years, and Mike absolutely loved being a reverend. He loved his congregation and his wife Diane and his 3 kids, who were 2 daughters and a son. They were all super involved in the church. It was a great life, but at the same time, being a reverend was a lot of work. It came with a lot of responsibility and a lot of daily stress. He spent long hours preparing sermons, organizing community events, counseling families in crisis, and managing the day-to-day operations of the church. Over the years, the way that Mike had found to cope with that growing stress was to go out hiking. He actually found it sort of ironic that when he was out in nature hiking, he felt much closer to God than when he was inside of his own church preaching. He looked at the natural world as this grand, beautiful gift from God. And when you are standing in the middle of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, looking at this unbelievable terrain, it really does look like something divine. And so with that as our context, on this particular day that Mike had stopped to sip his water, this was actually the 4th day of a pre-planned 9-day solo hike. Mike had been planning this trip out for over a year. He had spent hours sitting at his kitchen table, studying topological maps, looking at elevation lines, and marking coordinate by coordinate on his physical maps. Even though Mike was a very skilled hiker and survivalist, he knew that doing any sort of long solo hike came with a whole bunch of serious risks. The biggest risk, of course, is that if you get into trouble when you are out on a solo hike, you are completely alone. There is nobody there to help you, so you better have a really good plan for what you are going to do if something goes wrong. And Mike had come up with what he thought was a great plan. He had spent that whole year mapping out this off-trail path he was going to take over these 9 days. It was a 60-mile trip through the wilderness, and he drew out basically exactly where he expected to go on a paper map. He gave that map with all the different coordinates and exactly where he would be on each day to his wife Diane, who also happened to be a very enthusiastic hiker. He told her that on the 9th day of the trip she was going to meet him at a specific spot at the end of the 60-mile. The meeting place was at the start of a trail called the Big Sandy Trail. He told her that he would meet her there at exactly noon on that 9th day, and then she could take him home. However, that plan had changed on that 4th day as Mike was sipping his water on the mountainside. And only Mike knew it, because he had absolutely no way to communicate back to his friends and family. Cell phones back then in 1998 were very primitive, and there was certainly no cell service out in the middle of this deep wilderness, so he could not just call somebody to let them know he was changing his plans. Basically, if he deviated from his plan, he was the only living soul who would know. And then, the reason why Mike decided to alter his course on the fourth day of this 9-day trip actually made a lot of sense. Even though Mike was technically solo hiking, he was not actually completely alone. With him was the beloved family dog named Andy. Andy was a very good-natured, energetic black lab mix who absolutely loved going hiking with Mike. Whenever Mike grabbed his backpack, Andy would start jumping around and wagging his tail, ready for an adventure. Over the course of the previous day, and then into this fourth day, Mike and Andy had been up at a very high elevation, walking at about 13,000 feet. Up there, they had to cross some icy, snowy parts of the mountain. Because they were walking on this jagged, hard ice, Andy's paws were getting really raw and sensitive. On that fourth day, Mike had noticed that Andy was whimpering and struggling to keep up with him. This was very unusual because normally Andy was super energetic, running all around and chasing after sticks or sniffing the trail, but now the poor dog was limping, keeping his head down, and obviously in pain. Mike stopped and knelt down on the trail to examine Andy's paws. When he lifted one of the dog's front paws, he saw that the rough ice and rocks had worn the skin down to the point where it was raw and bleeding. Mike knew that the course he was supposed to take for the next few days was going to take them even higher into the mountains, where there would be even more ice and rugged rocks. He looked at his loyal dog and realized that Andy simply could not keep up. He was not going to be able to do it, and it would be cruel to force him to keep walking on those painful paws. And so, Mike made a decision. He decided to alter his course and side-skirt the mountains to avoid the high-altitude ice. Even though this new path was definitely going to take him a little bit longer, he figured it would still eventually bring him to the same final destination. It would still lead him to that same pickup spot at the Big Sandy Trailhead where his wife and his family would be waiting for him. But Mike understood the gravity of this decision. By deviating from his route, not only would his family have absolutely no idea where he was, but also this secondary route was going to take a lot longer than his original path. He knew he was not going to make it to the meeting spot at the time he had promised. He was not going to be there at noon on the 9th day. It was probably going to be the 10th day, or maybe even later. But Mike had planned for this kind of contingency. He was a smart survivalist, so he had brought extra food rations and extra fuel specifically in case he had to extend his journey. He felt totally confident that even though this was a big risk to take a path that nobody else knew he was on, he could handle it with no problems. He had the gear, he had the experience, and he had the confidence. And so, after Mike finished taking a sip of his water, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a collapsible bowl that was specifically for Andy. He poured some water from his bottle into the bowl and placed it gently on the ground. Andy slowly made his way over, limping slightly, and began lapping up the water. As the dog drank, Mike looked down and saw Andy's tail wagging happily. Mike felt a wave of relief. Seeing how much better his dog was already doing made him feel confident that this was definitely the right decision. Taking the secondary route to protect his dog's paws was absolutely the way to go. But as Mike waited for his dog to finish drinking, something unexpected happened. Andy suddenly stopped lapping the water. He lifted his head up high and his ears perked up. It was obvious he had sensed something out in the distance. And then, before Mike could even react or say a word, Andy just took off running. He bolted into the thick trees and disappeared. Now, Andy was a playful dog, and he would periodically run around on their hikes, but this was different. Remember, Mike is out in the middle of the deep backcountry. He has deviated from his path, and he needs to be absolutely sure of where he is. He cannot afford to make any mistakes out here, and he certainly cannot afford to lose his dog. If Andy went rogue and Mike had to go chasing after him, the chances of getting turned around or getting completely lost, or maybe even coming into contact with a large predator like a grizzly bear, were incredibly high. Mike knew he had to get his dog back immediately. He grabbed the water bowl, stuffed it quickly into his pack, and took off running into the trees after Andy. He was calling out the dog's name, his voice echoing through the silent forest. After running through the thick trees for a short distance, Mike emerged on the other side, and suddenly he was hit with this incredible view. He was looking down towards a beautiful, pristine mountain lake. But right in front of him, sloping down towards that lake, was a huge clearing on the side of the mountain. This clearing was filled with massive boulders. These were not just normal rocks. These were giant boulders, some of them the size of small cars, and they were everywhere. It looked like over thousands of years, as the mountain eroded, huge chunks of rock had broken off and rolled down into this clearing, which was at a steep slant down towards the lake. It filled the entire space to the point where you could not actually walk on solid ground. The only way to get across this clearing was to step on top of the boulders. And as Mike looked out over this massive field of rocks, he saw his dog. Andy was making his way down towards the lake, clearly drawn by the water. Mike tried calling for Andy one more time, yelling for him to stop and come back, but Andy was on his own program, totally focused on getting to that water. Realizing he had no other choice, Mike resigned himself to the situation. He climbed on top of the first large boulder, balanced himself, and began jumping from boulder to boulder, trying to catch up to his dog. At first, things were going fine. Mike was a big, strong man, and even with his heavy backpack on, he was making decent progress. He got about halfway across the boulder field, keeping his eyes on Andy, who was still heading down towards the lake. But then Mike reached one particularly large boulder. It looked solid, but when he jumped onto it, the rock was actually completely unstable. As soon as his feet hit the surface, the massive boulder began to wobble and tilt under his weight. Instinctively, Mike knew he was in trouble. He tried to quickly leap off the wobbly boulder onto another rock that was right nearby. But as he jumped, he did not get enough distance. He undershot the second boulder. Instead of landing cleanly on top of it, Mike's feet slipped and he hit the face of the second boulder, sliding down into the deep, narrow gap between the two rocks. Fortunately, the fall itself did not hurt him. He was standing on the ground in this small space, a bit shaken but uninjured. But before he could even take a breath and try to climb back up, the wobbly boulder behind him did not just stop moving. Because it was on a slant, the wobble had caused the massive rock to lose its balance entirely. It rolled forward, sliding down the slopes, and came to a sudden heavy stop right against the second boulder. The boulder that Mike had just failed to land on. Basically, this massive 800-pound rock had rolled forward and sandwiched Mike between itself and the other boulder. But critically, when this happened, it did not crush Mike. It did not break his bones or cause him any physical pain. And the reason for this was incredibly bizarre, almost like a cruel twist of fate. The wobbly boulder had a natural U-shaped cutout on its face. It was like a deep divot in the rock. And by pure coincidence, the second boulder in front of it also had a similar U-shaped cutout on its face. When these two massive rocks collided and pressed together, Mike happened to be standing in the exact spot where those two cutouts met. The two curved pieces of stone wrapped perfectly around his ankles, acting exactly like a pair of heavy granite shackles. They pinned his legs together at the ankles, locking them in a tight space that was just big enough to hold them, but too small for him to pull his feet up and out. He was completely anchored to the ground. He could stand up, he could move his upper body, but his feet were locked in place. He was completely trapped. Mike instantly knew that this was an incredibly serious situation. He was stuck in the middle of a massive boulder field, miles away from any trail, with an 800-pound rock holding him down. He was completely by himself, except for his dog Andy, who obviously could not help him move a giant boulder. Mike did not panic right away. He immediately went into survival mode, trying to figure out a way to free himself. He figured if he could just move one of the boulders even a tiny fraction of an inch, it would be enough to release his ankles. He struggled out of his heavy backpack, letting it drop nearby. One by one, he pulled out his gear, he grabbed his metal camera tripod, thinking he could use it as a pry bar. He jammed the metal legs into the gap between the rocks and threw his entire weight against it, trying to lever the boulders apart. But the tripod just bent and twisted under the pressure. He tried using his metal stove, his metal water bottle, and any other hard object he had, trying desperately to find some leverage. He pushed and shoved with all of his strength, his muscles straining, his hands getting scraped and bloody against the rough granite. But the 800-pound boulders did not budge even a millimeter. After 2 hours of exhausting, frantic effort, the harsh reality finally began to sink in. Mike realized that he was absolutely not going to be able to free himself on his own. The boulders were just too heavy, and he was wedged in too tightly. The only way he was ever going to get out of this place alive was if someone came and rescued him. But the problem was, nobody knew where he was. Mike sat down as best as he could, wedged in the gap, and pulled out his blue journal. He had brought this along to write down his thoughts during his spiritual journey, but now it became a daily record of his fight for survival. He wrote down exactly how he had gotten trapped, so that if anyone found his body or his gear, they would know his story. He wrote about chasing Andy, the unstable boulder, and the heavy rocks that now held him captive. Despite the terror of his situation, Mike's first entry was filled with faith. He wrote that he was in God's hands and that he trusted God would help him through this. Once he finished writing, he turned his attention to setting up a survival camp in the tiny space he had. He wrapped his bright blue sleeping bag around himself to stay warm, and he pulled his heavy tent flap over his head to shield himself from the freezing wind. He saw that there were still a few patches of snow on the rocks within his reach, so he used his small stove to melt the snow into drinking water. That first night was pure torture. The temperature at 11,000 feet dropped to near freezing, and Mike lay there shivering, completely alone in the dark wilderness, listening to the wind and praying for rescue. The next morning, on the second day, Mike wrote in his journal again. This time, his writing showed his growing fears. He was terrified that the pressure on his ankles was cutting off his circulation, and that he might lose his legs. He also realized he was running out of water. He had only 2 quarts left, and the snow around him was melting fast in the hot sun. The most agonizing part was that he was sitting only 30 feet away from a beautiful, clear lake. He tried to tie a rope to his water bottle and throw it into the lake, but his throw was too short and the bottle got stuck in some rocks on the shore. He could not pull it back, and he could not walk over to free it. His only water bottle was gone. By the end of the second day, Mike was starting to realize just how desperate his situation was. He even joked in his journal about what his own urine would taste like if he mixed it with a Crystal Light packet, a dark attempt to cope with the reality of dying of thirst. On the third day, Mike experienced a strange burst of optimism. He wrote that he felt incredibly close to God and that this experience was a powerful spiritual event. He seemed convinced that he would be rescued, and he promised to be a better husband, father, and reverend once he got home. But as the days dragged on and no rescue came, that hope turned into deep despair. By the fifth day, Mike was suffering terribly from exposure, sunburn, and dehydration. He began to express anger and confusion in his journal, asking why God had abandoned him and if he was being punished. He felt a crushing, agonizing sense of loneliness. And so, things got even worse. Mike wrote that he had completely lost all feeling in his left leg. He knew his body was shutting down. In his journal, he wrote that he was so lonely, more than he had ever imagined. It is hard to picture the mental torture of sitting there in the silent mountains, slowly dying, knowing your family has no idea where you are. Around the sixth day, Mike accidentally dropped his journal into a deep crack between the rocks where he could not reach it. But he was determined to leave a message for his family. He began writing in the margins of his pocket Bible and on the paper instruction manual for his stove. His handwriting became incredibly shaky and hard to read as his body grew weaker. He wrote about his deep regret for changing his route, knowing that if he had stuck to his original plan, the searchers would have found him days ago. But by the ninth day, as he entered the final stages of dehydration, Mike seemed to find a sense of peace. He stopped fighting and accepted his fate. He wrote beautiful, heartbreaking messages to his wife Diane and his 3 kids, telling them how much he loved them and wondering about their futures. He prayed for peace and wrote that he was ready to die. His final entry was almost entirely illegible, just faint, scribbled lines on the page. But at the very end, he managed to write, "Love, Dad." Then, Mike did one last, thoughtful thing. He knew that after he died, his body would decompose and his gold wedding band might slip off his finger and get lost in the rocks. He wanted Diane to have it. So, with his last remaining strength, he took off the ring and placed it carefully on a flat rock next to him. Then he lay back and closed his eyes. Meanwhile, completely unaware of the tragedy, Mike's family was waiting for him. On the afternoon of August 8th, which was the 9th day of Mike's planned trip, Diane Turner, her 3 children, and some family friends drove to the Big Sandy trailhead. This was the meeting spot Mike had marked on the map. They arrived early, excited to welcome him home. But noon came and went, and there was no sign of Mike. Diane tried not to worry. She knew 60 miles off trail was a long way, and it was normal to be delayed. They waited all day and camped out at the trailhead overnight. The next day, August 9th, was the critical deadline. Mike had told Diane that if he was still not there by 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 9th, she must assume something had gone wrong and called the police. Diane sat by the trail all day watching her watch. When 4 o'clock passed and Mike was still not there, Diane hesitated. She knew calling in a search party was a massive, expensive operation, and she kept hoping Mike would walk out of the woods at any moment. She decided to wait one more night. But on the morning of August 10th, there was still no sign of him. Diane knew she could not wait any longer. She drove to the nearest ranger station and reported Mike missing. The authorities immediately launched a massive search. Over the next 2 weeks, helicopters with thermal imaging cameras flew over the mountains, searchers on horseback rode through the valleys, and hundreds of volunteers combed the 60-mile route Mike had drawn on his map. But they found absolutely nothing. They did not know that Mike had changed his route and was trapped miles away, completely outside of the search area. The helicopters could not see him because his blue sleeping bag blended into the shadows of the boulders. After 2 weeks of searching with 0 clues, the authorities had to call off the search. The family was devastated, forced to go home to Idaho with no answers. Fast forward to 5 days after the search ended. On August 28th, a couple of backpackers were hiking through a remote section of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. They were about 17 miles away from where Mike had started his hike. They knew about the missing reverend, and as they stopped to take a break, they heard a faint whimpering sound. Out of the trees walked a black lab. It was Andy. The dog was in terrible shape. He was extremely emaciated, his ribs were showing, and his paws were raw and bleeding. The backpackers gently called to him, fed him some granola bars, and gave him water. They led Andy down the trail and contacted the authorities. Finding Andy alive brought a massive wave of hope to Mike's family. They thought that if Andy had survived for 28 days, Mike must be alive too. A second search was launched, and they used Andy as a guide dog, hoping he would lead them back to Mike. But Andy was still weak and disoriented, and they could not find the exact spot, and then a separate backpacker, who we will call Brian, was hiking through a totally different part of the wilderness. Brian was not part of the search, but he had seen the missing person flyers. He was hiking miles off trail when he reached a steep mountain slope about 11,000 feet up. He walked through a cluster of trees and emerged into a massive boulder field. As he stood there looking at the beautiful view of the lake, he noticed a man sitting on a rock far across the field with his back to him. The man was completely motionless. Brian called out, but there was no response. Feeling uneasy, Brian climbed onto the rocks and made his way over. When he got close, he gasped. The man was wedged tightly between two massive boulders. His legs were pinned at the ankles by two giant rocks that had rolled together. It was Mike Turner. He had been dead for some time. Brian saw the blue sleeping bag, the camera, and the gold wedding ring sitting on the flat rock. He found Mike's wallet and confirmed his identity. Because he was so deep in the backcountry, it took Brian 3 days of fast hiking to reach a ranger station and report the discovery. The recovery team flew a helicopter to the coordinates and finally freed Mike's body from the boulders. When they recovered his gear, they found the blue journal, the pocket Bible, and the stove manual. By reading his final writings, the authorities were able to reconstruct the entire heartbreaking timeline. They realized Mike had survived for 10 days in the rocks. The journal revealed his initial faith, his struggle, his anger, and his ultimate peace. The investigation also showed that when they were using Andy as a guide dog, Andy had indeed been leading the searchers in the exact direction of the boulder field. He was a loyal dog trying to save his owner, but they just did not have enough time. The impact of Mike's death on his family and congregation was devastating, but his final words provided a small amount of comfort, showing that he had died with a heart full of love and faith. And to make the story even more tragic, on the day Mike left for his hike, a delivery truck had arrived at his home in Idaho. It was a beautiful bouquet of flowers that Mike had secretly ordered to arrive after he left. Attached was a note to his wife Diane, telling her how much he loved her and how much he was looking forward to the moment he would walk out of the wilderness and see her waiting for him at the big sandy trailhead. At this point, we need to talk about how the family began to process this loss. The sheer weight of knowing that Mike had spent those 10 days waiting and writing was both a curse and a blessing. It was a curse because of the unimaginable pain he had gone through, but it was a blessing because they knew his final thoughts. They knew he had not died in sudden terror, but had slowly transitioned into a place of profound peace. Diane took the journal and held it close. She read the entries to her 3 children, and together they cried, but they also found comfort in knowing that Mike's love for them was the last thing on his mind before he closed his eyes. To make sure we understand the exact details of the rescue and recovery, the sheriff's office released a report explaining that the boulders Mike was trapped in were made of solid granite. Each of these rocks was estimated to weigh over 800 pounds, which made it absolutely impossible for a single human being to move them without heavy mechanical assistance. The U-shaped cutouts on the faces of the rocks were a natural geological formation caused by centuries of water erosion and freezing temperatures. It was a 1 in a million occurrence that Mike's ankles ended up perfectly aligned within these 2 matching divots. It was a tragic, freak accident that could not have been predicted by even the most experienced survivalists. And so, the search and rescue teams learned a valuable lesson from Mike's tragedy. They realized that when searching for missing hikers, they must look beyond the designated trails and even beyond the planned routes. Sometimes a hiker will make a logical decision to divert from their path, and those diversions must be taken into account during the search process. Today, search and rescue operations use highly advanced GPS tracking systems and satellite messengers, which has made it much easier to locate people who find themselves in trouble. If Mike had been hiking today, he would have had a satellite communicator that would have allowed him to send an emergency signal immediately, and he would have been rescued within hours. But back in 1998, he was completely at the mercy of the elements and his own strength. When the recovery team arrived at the boulder field with their helicopter, they knew it would not be an easy task to retrieve Mike's body. The helicopter could not land directly on the steep, rock-strewn slope, so the pilots had to hover nearby while a team of 5 highly trained sheriff's deputies and rescue workers descended onto the rocks. They carried heavy steel crowbars, thick nylon straps, and a specialized portable hydraulic spreader, which is a tool often used by firefighters to pry open crushed vehicles. The rescuers worked in silence, the only sound being the wind blowing across the clearing and the metallic clank of their tools against the hard granite. They carefully positioned the hydraulic spreader in the narrow gap between the 2 giant boulders, just above Mike's pinned ankles. As the operator pumped the handle, the hydraulic cylinder began to expand, applying thousands of pounds of pressure against the rocks. The granite let out a sharp, groaning sound, and slowly, the wobbly 800-pound boulder began to shift backward. It moved just a few inches, but it was enough to release the tight grip on Mike's ankles. The deputies gently lifted Mike's body out of the gap, wrapped him in a protective sheet, and prepared him for transport. They also took great care to collect every single piece of his gear, making sure not to leave anything behind that might contain clues or hold sentimental value for his family. They picked up the bent camera tripod, the small stove, the camera, and the water bottle that was still wedged in the shoreline rocks. And of course, they carefully retrieved the gold wedding band from the flat rock, placing it in a secure pouch. When the medical examiner eventually performed the autopsy, they confirmed the details that Mike had written in his final notes. The official cause of death was exposure and dehydration. The examiner noted that Mike's body was remarkably strong, and it was his incredible physical conditioning that allowed him to survive for 10 full days in such harsh conditions. But without water, the human body can only last so long. The examiner explained that as dehydration sets in, the blood volume decreases, causing the heart to work much harder to pump oxygen to the organs. This leads to extreme fatigue, muscle cramps, and eventually severe hallucinations. By day 5 or 6, Mike's mind would have started to play tricks on him. He wrote in his Bible about hearing the laughter of his children, believing they were playing just out of his sight behind the trees. He also wrote about hearing the sound of running water, which was a cruel trick of his mind as he stared at the lake he could not reach. The physical pain of his numb leg was accompanied by the mental anguish of these hallucinations, making his survival even more of a testament to his strength. Back in Idaho, Diane and the children were trying to adjust to a life without Mike. The return of Andy the dog was a source of great comfort, but also great sadness. In the weeks following the tragedy, Andy's paws slowly began to heal. The raw, bleeding skin closed up, and the black lab mix was eventually able to walk without a limp. But the family noticed a profound change in the dog's behavior. Andy was no longer the hyperactive, playful dog he used to be. He would spend hours sitting by the front door of the house, his ears perked up, listening for the sound of Mike's car pulling into the driveway. Whenever someone walked through the door, Andy would jump up with hope in his eyes, only to slowly lay back down when he realized it was not Mike. The family realized that Andy was grieving just as they were. He had been there when Mike got trapped, and he had spent days trying to find help, only to return to an empty house. Diane would sit on the floor next to Andy, wrapping her arms around his neck, and they would comfort each other in their shared loss. The note that had arrived with the bouquet of flowers on the day Mike left was eventually framed and placed on the mantel in the Turner home. The note was a beautiful reflection of Mike's love and his positive outlook on life. In the note, Mike had written that he was so grateful for Diane's support and that he knew his solo trips were hard on her. He wrote that he looked forward to these hikes because they allowed him to recharge his spiritual batteries, but he also wrote that the best part of any journey was coming home to her. He told her that he would be thinking of her every step of the 60 miles, and that he would be counting down the days until they were reunited at the Big Sandy Trailhead. The flowers eventually withered, but the note remained a constant reminder of the deep, unbreakable bond they shared. The search and rescue community in Wyoming also paid tribute to Mike. They created a special training program named in his honor, focusing on off-trail navigation and survival techniques for solo hikers. The rangers at the Fitzpatrick Wilderness often share Mike's story with visitors, using it as a powerful cautionary tale about the importance of safety and the unpredictability of the mountains. They remind hikers that even the most experienced outdoors people can find themselves at the mercy of a freak accident, and that having a reliable way to communicate with the outside world is absolutely essential. The community in Idaho held a large memorial service for Mike at his church. Hundreds of people attended, and they shared stories of his kindness, his wisdom, and his love for the outdoors. Diane and the kids stood at the front of the church, holding the bouquet of flowers that had arrived after Mike left. They knew that even though Mike was gone, his spirit would always be with them in the beautiful mountains he loved so much. And every year on the anniversary of his death, Diane and her children make a trip to the Fitzpatrick Wilderness to look at the massive peaks and remember the brave, loving man who touched so many lives. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Short A hiker vanished in the Wyoming wilderness, but the strangest clue came 28 days later. Mike Turner, a 48-year-old reverend, was on a solo mountain trip with his dog Andy when he suddenly changed routes to protect the dog's bleeding paws. Then Andy ran toward a lake, and Mike followed. In a field of giant boulders, one rock shifted and trapped Mike's ankles like stone handcuffs. Search teams looked everywhere, except the path he secretly took. The only suspect was the wilderness itself. Twist, Andy survived and tried leading rescuers back. But Mike's journal revealed the heartbreaking truth. Watch the full story on our channel.